Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Tatum Chronicles. This is Chapter 4. You can find the hard copy at www.thebookpatch.com. Now, on to the audio. In 1979, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, overthrew General Somoza, ending the Somoza dynasty and establishing a revolutionary government in Nicaragua backed by the Soviet Union. Their leader was Daniel Ortega. The first challenge to the powerful new army came from the Contras. These were groups of Somoza's National Guard who had fled to Honduras. The Contras were soon under the control of Nicaraguan business elites who opposed Sandinista policies to seize their assets. The Contra chain of command included some ex-National Guardsmen, including Contra founder and commander Enrique Bermudez, and others. One prominent Contra commander, however, was ex-Sandinista hero Eden Pastora, aka Comandante Zero, who had rejected the Leninist orientation of his fellow commandantes. In an effort to help grow the Contra effort, the CIA promised to support in the form of food, arms, money, and training anyone who agreed to migrate to one of the several Contra camps set up on the Honduran border area of Nicaragua. Ex-Somozan military and their families joined the effort, filling the various Contra camps, knowing that they had the support of the CIA and the United States military. U.S. officials were active in attempting to unite the Contra groups. In June of '85, most of the groups reorganized as the United Nicaraguan Opposition, UNO, under the leadership of Adolfo Calero, Arturo Cruz, and Alfonso Robelo. The U.S. government viewed the leftist Soviet-supported Sandinistas as a threat to economic interests of American corporations in Nicaragua and to national security. U.S. President Ronald Reagan stated in 1983 that the defense of the USA's southern frontier was at stake, in spite of the Sandinista victory being declared fair. The United States continued to oppose the left-wing Nicaraguan government and opposed its ties to Cuba and the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan, who had assumed the American presidency in January 1981, accused the Sandinistas of importing Cuban-style socialism and aiding leftist guerrillas in El Salvador. Now, the Reagan administration continued to view the Sandinistas as undemocratic despite the '84 Nicaraguan elections being generally declared fair by foreign observers. On 4 January 1982, Reagan signed the top-secret National Security Decision Directive 17, NSDD-17, giving the CIA the authority to recruit and support the Contras with $19 million in military aid. The efforts to support the Contras was one component of Reagan doctrine, which called for providing military support to movements opposing Soviet-supported communist governments. By December 1981, however, the United States had already begun to support armed opponents of the Sandinista government. From the beginning, the CIA was in charge. The arming, clothing, feeding, and supervision of the Contras became the most ambitious paramilitary and political action operation mounted by the agency in over a decade. Congress caught on to it, and they cut off all funds for the Contras in 1985 by the Third Boland Amendment. The Boland Amendment had first been passed in Congress in 1982. At this time, it only outlawed U.S. assistance to Contras for the purpose of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government, while allowing assistance for other purposes. In October 1984, it was amended to forbid action by not only the Defense Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, but all U.S. government agencies. Humanitarian medical assistance was the only authorized action by the United States. Thus, medevac dust-off helicopters were based in Pomarola, Honduras, in support of the Contra effort, and the NSA, the CIA, and others. Placed in charge of this effort was a Lieutenant Colonel United States Marines named Oliver North. He was working out of the National Reconnaissance Office, but had access to the President and the Vice President of the United States. I thought it necessary to begin this chapter with that little explanation of what and who the Contras were all about, and who was really in charge. You're listening to the Tatum Chronicles. This is Chapter 4. March 18th, 1985. I was called at 0500 hours and told that there were 3 wounded soldiers at a Contra camp outside of Choluteca. We launched and picked up 2 observers in Choluteca as ordered. Mr. North and a Lieutenant Colonel Ramon Navarro. Mr. North is, yes, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. He was in charge of our missions in Honduras. I had met Lieutenant Colonel Navarro on previous flights into Contra camps. However, his uniform was not that of the U.S. or Honduran military. We then proceeded to the Contra camp, where our medic administered to the casualties. We loaded 2 of the casualties and were waiting for Specialist McDonald, our medic, to finish with the last patient. The last patient had a piece of what seemed to be wood sticking out of a bad wound in the upper left portion of his body. When we attempted to clean the area, we found a hole the size of a softball adjacent to the impaled object. McDonald began cleaning the area, causing a clear view of muscle hanging and the inside of the chest cavity. Mr. North fainted. I caught him and popped an ammonia capsule to bring him around. We then departed and delivered the casualties to San Lorenzo. I would see Ramon Navarro on several occasions. The last time I saw Ramon was February 27, 1991. Here's a little history behind that. In 1990, the United States arrested General Manuel Noriega. General Noriega had been indicted by federal grand jury under a drug conspiracy law. 2 of General Noriega's co-defendants were severed from the general and scheduled for trial in early 1991. One of the government's key witnesses against the 2 co-defendants was Ramon Navarro. Navarro knew from past experience how valuable his testimony would be. After being subpoenaed, Navarro contacted Felix Rodriguez, one of his handlers from the Contra cocaine manufacturing facilities. Navarro told Rodriguez that he wanted $1 million cash, or he would not only testify about Noriega's involvement with drug manufacturing and trafficking, but he would also indicate Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Oliver North, President Bush, and others. Having been recruited into a covert operation intelligence unit in 1986, directed by William Colby and George Bush, I was tasked with the mission of delivering the money with its terms to Mr. Navarro. On February 26, 1991, an Archer team, consisting of 3 assassins and 1 tracker, began surveillance of Mr. Navarro. A Saberliner was flown into Miami Airport with a satchel of money containing $1 million. It had been arranged through Adolfo Calero, an ex-Contra leader, now in the Chamorro government of Nicaragua, for Mr. Navarro to relocate and live in Nicaragua. Mr. Bush felt that it would be too dangerous for Navarro to testify. I was ordered by Colby to give Navarro the money and take him to the Saberliner. I was further instructed that, if Navarro refused to relocate, he was to be terminated on the spot. 2 Archers were placed at Navarro's home the night of February 27, 1991. I was stationed outside of Navarro's girlfriend's house with the Major. The Major is a code name for an Archer team leader, and another Archer awaiting his status. Mr. Navarro exited his girlfriend's house at about 11:30 p.m. I exited my vehicle and approached Ramon. When Navarro saw me approaching, he jumped in his car and sped off down the road. The red BMW was speeding through the streets of Miami at about 80 miles per hour, with our 2 vehicles in pursuit. We notified the team at his home, and they were prepared to apprehend him. Suddenly, Navarro lost control and crossed the median, crashing into a fence. Navarro was dead. We stopped and ensured that he was dead, and then departed. I returned the satchel of money to the aircraft. On making my report, I advised of the situation. I was then advised that the mule would oversee the cleanup. The mule, Robert Mueller. The following day, a New York Times article referred to the accident. Here it is. The death of Ramon A. Navarro, a 41-year-old paid informer for the government, threw the trial into turmoil and appeared to weaken the case against General Noriega, who will be tried separately in June. Mr. Navarro was killed about 11:30 p.m. Wednesday after he lost control of the car he was driving. He was alone on a two-lane road southwest of Miami, the Metro-Dade police said. Today, traffic homicide investigators were reviewing the circumstances surrounding the crash. Although such inquiries are routine, a police spokesman said the police were investigating the crash because the victim was a government witness in an important drug prosecution. An assistant U.S. attorney in Miami, Robert Mueller, was quoted by the Associated Press as saying that his office would look into the circumstances of the crash. A spokesman for the FBI in Miami said today that the agency had not been asked to investigate the crash. A spokesman for the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration of Miami, which conducted the investigation that led to the Noriega indictment, declined to comment on Mr. Navarro's death. There you have it. Enter the mule, Robert Mueller. On March 22, 1985, I was asked to provide transportation for the following passengers back to Tegucigalpa: General Gustavo Alvarez, Felix Rodriguez, Mike Harari, Mossad, working with General Noriega. Major Rodriguez advised me that I would need to modify aircraft number 228 for a flight through Nicaragua to Costa Rica on the 24th. I rogered and returned to Pomerola. Upon arriving, I arranged for the modifications. The modifications included 4 Stinger missiles, which were to be attached outside of the aircraft only if detection and acquisition were inevitable. On the 24th of March 1985, I was ordered to deliver passengers to El Ocotal, Costa Rica, a coastal town on the Pacific side of Costa Rica, and also to gather vital intel from moles at Ojo de Agua, El Tamarcito, Nicaragua. It was necessary for passengers to meet with contacts at Ojo de Agua and brief prior to the meeting in Costa Rica. Intel report as follows. It was determined by intelligence provided by Wally World that both radar threat and airborne patrols of Soviet-built Hind D were in place. It was therefore determined that we would use a modified medevac UH-1. If detected in a low-level nap-at-the-earth flight across Nicaragua, it was most likely that the Sandinistas would not shoot down a humanitarian aircraft. The modification to the UH-1 were gun mounts ready to be swung out of the aircraft with 2 Stinger missiles mounted on each side. The mission was flown at top altitude of 12 feet above ground level. The mission was flown as briefed. The first leg of the flight was eventful. Utilizing the terrain elevation of the Cordillera Range northeast of Managua as a shield against Nicaraguan radar, the mission was flown with minimal hits of the APR-39, which is a radar indicator. The following passengers and crew participated in the meeting in Ojo de Agua: Mr. Rodriguez, General Alvarez, and Joe Fernandez. Mr. Harari showed minimal interest in the intel. Familiarization with the usage of the photo equipment followed the briefing. I refueled from a tactical ball dropped a day earlier. We carried 2 ox fuel bladders in the hellholes of the chopper. The flight resumed to El Ocotal, Costa Rica, with minimal hits on the APR-39. The meeting was held at a remote seaside retreat. A communication center was set up at the chopper, utilizing a phone provided by Mr. Fernandez. Attending the meeting were the following: General Manuel Noriega of Panama, Mike Harari, now in Panama, Felix Rodriguez, United States, Joe Fernandez, United States CIA, ex-General Gustavo Alvarez, Honduras, William Barr, United States. Via SATCOM link, we spoke with Oliver North, U.S. National Security Council, William Clinton, Governor of Arkansas, George Bush, U.S. Vice President. General Noriega and Mr. Barr greeted the aircraft when we arrived. The passengers adjourned to their meeting while I secured the aircraft. I was invited to join when I finished. 2 Latin American soldiers set up the SATCOM device and stood guard on the aircraft. I joined the meeting approximately 30 minutes later. When I arrived, the discussion was concerning the loss of over $100 million worth of drugs and cash. The enterprise was being drained. There were 3 compact computers set up with operators, obviously working for Mr. Barr. There were approximately 8 administrative personnel correlating data provided by computer disks brought by the principals of the meeting. The discussions continued. It was obvious that the purpose of the meeting was to identify the source of the loss. The money flow was traced from Panama to several destinations in the U.S. Their Ohio source was ruled out early. Their Colorado source was also ruled out. That left Arkansas. It was discussed by the members that either Seal or Clinton were siphoning from the enterprise. At this point, my food was brought, so I moved to a separate table and ate. By the time I had finished eating, Mr. Fernandez signaled me to join him. We went back to the aircraft and used the phone. He called Mr. North and told him that the loss was definitely occurring on the Arkansas drop. He said that means either Seal, Clinton, or Noriega. I thought it noteworthy that Mr. Fernandez added General Noriega to the suspect list. He hung up. I started back, but Fernandez stopped me and told me to get Barr and Rodriguez. I summoned Barr and Rodriguez to the aircraft. About 15 minutes later, the phone activated and Barr answered. He listened, not speaking, but nodding. When he spoke, he told the caller that it had been determined that the problem existed on the Arkansas connection. I would propose that no one source would be bold enough to siphon out that much money, but it is more plausible that each are siphoning a portion, causing a drastic loss. He then acknowledged something with a yes sir, and told the caller he would see him and give him an update report 2 days later. At that point, the phone was handed to me. I answered. Tatum, Vice President Bush asked me to ensure that General Noriega and Mr. Harari boarded Seal's plane and departed prior to my departure. He also wanted the tail number of Seal's plane. I was told to tell no one that we spoke. He then instructed me to pass the tail number to North via landlines when I returned to base. I acknowledged and handed the phone back to Barr. Barr stated that he and Fernandez were staying in Costa Rica until the following day. They needed to visit the ranch. Then he terminated the call. Mr. Barr then made another call. He asked for Governor Clinton. He must have had a direct number because he didn't have to wait. He began immediately. He explained that a substantial amount of enterprise monies had disappeared. He further explained to the governor that it was suspected to be in excess of $100 million and that it was definitely disappearing along the Panama to Arkansas connection. He suggested that Governor Clinton investigate on that end and that he and Mr. North would continue investigating on the Panama side and that it must be resolved or it could lead to problems. Big problems, he reiterated. He then asked Clinton to put his best man on it and stated that this was priority 1. Then he terminated the call. We broke down the equipment. I dropped Noriega and Harari at the airport and waited for Seal to leave in a Learjet, tail number N13SN. Then I returned the other passengers to Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. This is the content of the meeting and mission. The following is the mission, flight plan, and passenger list. Copies of the passenger list, the flight plan, international flight plan, certified, are all there, including remarks from the flight. March 30th, 1985. We arranged to remain overnight in Tela, Honduras. We settled into the hotel and I excused myself for the night. I walked to the airfield, it was approximately 1 mile away, and flew the helicopter to La Ceiba. I picked up the following passengers. Mr. North, representing the CIA and Vice President Bush. Felix Rodriguez, CIA, acting as co-pilot. Ex-General Alvarez of Honduras, Amiram Nir, CIA, and Mossad. We flew into several villages on the Nicaraguan-Honduras border to recon for a later mission. I recorded actual village locations for cargo drops by CH-47 scheduled later in April. 3 of the villages were Rus Rus, Waspam, and Santa Ana. Mr. North was pleased with the operations. He stated that Vice President Bush appreciated the extra effort I was giving. General Alvarez told Mr. North of my ability to sneak into his airfield under their radar. He asked North if I could instruct some of his security team and pilots for future use. North declined. We landed at Santa Ana and met with Enrique Bermudez and other Contra leaders. We were then taken to a small processing area of some sort. As we approached, there was a strong smell of jet fuel and acetone. There were several tactical bladders used for carrying fuels sitting around the area. 6 large fuel pods were on the ground, but had the tops torched off. Inside, there was fuel and ground-up coca leaves. Mr. North stated the following to the other passengers: "One more year of this and we'll all retire." He then made a remark concerning Barry Seal and Governor Clinton. "If we can keep those Arkansas hicks in line, that is," referring to the loss of monies as determined the week prior during their meeting in Costa Rica. I stood silently by the vat of leaves, listening to the conversation. General Alvarez had gone with the Contra leader to discuss logistics. The other 3, North, Rodriguez, and Amiram Nir, continued through the wooden building inspecting the cocaine. North continued, "But he," referring to Vice President Bush, "is very concerned about those missing monies. I think he's going to have Jeb," meaning Jeb Bush, "arrange something out of Colombia." He told his comrades, not thinking twice of my presence. What Mr. North was referring to ended up being the assassination of Barry Seal by members of the Medellin cartel in early 1986. "How about pineapple?" Rodriguez asked, speaking of General Noriega. "Nah," North answered. "Something's up there. They put the mule on it." Bush later ensured Noriega was indicted and imprisoned for drug trafficking. I recalled the mysterious Army officer's remarks in Ojo de Agua. "Tell no one. There's no one big enough in your chain of command." I just heard North tell Rodriguez that the Vice President, the Governor of Arkansas, and 3 of them were manufacturing cocaine. I flew them back to La Ceiba, and I continued back to Tela in time for drinks downtown with my crew and friends. We returned the following day to Pomerola. I later found out that the mule was a reference to U.S. Attorney's Office and a man named Robert Mueller. Mr. Mueller would become an integral part of our teams, and his ability to make legal issues appear or disappear was amazing. I went to Ops, put a few notes on the back of the flight plan. April 6, 1985. 6 coolers marked medical supplies were delivered to dust-off operations. We were tasked with dropping them off in Trujillo at the airstrip. We met a U.S. Air Force C-130 bound for Panama and passed the coolers of cocaine to them. I asked the pilot, "Who gets these?" He looked at his manifest and told me that a Dr. Harari would be called upon arrival. On April 9, 1985, we flew into a small village 40 kilometers northeast of Acatal in Nicaragua. Rodriguez was there with Contra leader Enrique Bermudez when we arrived. He walked through the camp, which was still being cleared and organized. 4 fuel pods with their tops cut off were sitting outside a large military tent. Several tactical fuel balls were located next to the pods. Rodriguez told the air crew that this was a Sandinista base that was captured. I noted that all of the equipment, the GP large tent, the fuel pods, and tactical fuel balls were U.S. made, and inside the tent were several women packaging cocaine. When we left, we carried 4 110-quart white coolers marked as medical supplies to San Lorenzo, dropped them off to a civilian C-123, and returned to base. The following day, we would meet up with Barry Seal, but that is the next chapter. Thank you for listening. You're listening to the Tatum Chronicles. This is Chapter 4. Hard copies of the Tatum Chronicles are available at www.thebookpatch.com, www.thebookpatch.com. Simply click on the bookstore and type in Tatum. You'll find my books.